Agenda item 7, receive, consider, and act upon a review of the Incorporation study financial model and determination of a proposed maximum initial tax rate related to Incorporation planning study. I think now that we're allowed to talk, I'll say that many of the great questions that you guys opined on in your public comments, a lot of this presentation will hit those financial aspects and hopefully answer and plug some of the holes for you that you had questions about.
Good afternoon, Board of Directors and all of our visitors here. My name is Monique Sharp. For those of you who don't know me, my long title is Assistant General Manager of Finance and Administration, but one of my primary responsibilities is serving as the Finance Director for the Township. So today I am going to walk us all through as carefully and as detailed as I can through the incorporation model. But here, what you're seeing here is just sort of a list of the layers of that make up the incorporation model. So starting at the bottom, we have the 2022 base budget. We have reviewed that with the Board of Directors, and those were public meetings, and those videos are online. July 23rd and 24th, there were some board planning sessions, and then again a presentation at the July 28th board meeting. And I'm saying that because today I'm not going to go over in hardly any detail at all the base budget. I'm just going to talk about the parts that we've been waiting on in order to complete that, which is the property tax, the certified tax rolls, and we also just got an updated sales tax report. And then next week, on Monday, start our budget workshops, and we'll be discussing that a little bit more. There's also, besides the base budget, what we call budget initiatives, which the base budget just continues the same level of services and amenities we have. And then every year the board considers various budget initiatives that would enhance services, or sometimes what we always strive for is to be able to lower cost while maintaining services. So those are things that they look at. And the budget task force did meet on August 5th, and then the budget initiatives will be discussed next week at the budget workshops. So the primary focus for today is to look at the incorporation initiatives. We had a preliminary review of those back in June 23rd, again a public meeting, and that video is available. And then today we're going to do a review of that and look at the tax rate that's generated from the updated model. So with that, I'm going to start off this presentation with going through the base budget and looking at the certified tax roll. So based on the certified tax roll, which the board will accept that report at your first budget workshop, but here is a preview of that. The certified taxable values were $21.7 billion. That's an increase from $21.1 billion in the previous tax year. The increase that we saw due to revaluation of existing properties was 2.3%. The increase in values due to new property was about 1.1% for a total increase in value of 3.4%. The tax rates that were calculated and certified by the tax assessor's office, Montgomery County Tax Assessor, looking at our current rate, which is 22.31 cents per $100 of valuation, and then our no new revenue rate, previously called the effective tax rate, is 21.81. So that's exactly a half penny lower than the current rate. And then the voter approval rate, which is the rate at which, if the board set a rate above that would require voter approval, is at 23.25. The current M&O rate is 22.53, and then we had an unused increment from the previous tax year of the 0.0072.
So Monique, while we're on this slide, because I'm not sure, since we got a lot of new people here, this new law regarding property tax protects our residents and businesses from the accelerated taxing of their property.
Correct.
And so whether we're a township or a city, that protection remains in place. I know there was a comment made about the initial maximum tax rate only, being solid for a year. Whatever that tax rate is, is actually projected to cover costs in year 4 of the transition plan. But irregardless of that, this calculation that limits the ability of a city or a town or a county to increase your taxes without voter approval is still intact.
Correct.
So whatever that initial maximum tax rate calculation comes out to, it can't go above a 3.5% increase without voter approval. No matter what you hear, this is the new law, and this is something we have to do every year now.
That's right.
And all property taxing authorities have to go through the same calculations,
That is correct. Thank you.
except the school boards.
Yeah, well, yes. So the components of the rate as it stands now, you can see there the maintenance and operations, and then we have a debt service rate to cover our outstanding bonds, our GO bonds. And then just as a point of reference, each penny of the township's tax rate generates about $2.18 million in revenue. So I wanted to put the no new revenue rate in perspective for everyone. So again, as I mentioned, it's about a half penny lower than the current rate on an average value home in the Woodlands, which is about $459,000. That if the rate is lowered by the half penny, that would reduce tax on an average value home by about $22.95. And then the township reduction in revenue related to that would be about $1.1 million. Here is a look historically at our property tax rate and what the Board of Directors has, the decisions they've made since 2000. Well, let me start at the very beginning. At 2009, when we were still a homeowners association, we had an ad valorem fee, and the composite rate was about 42 cents, the average between the 3 associations. Since then, you can see there we started off the township with about a 32.8 cent rate. And then it has declined over time in almost all of those years, except for 2 when there were some economic conditions affecting us. We have the board has chosen to lower to what was the effective tax rate, and now the no new revenue rate. You can see the sharper decline in the early years from 2010 through 2015, and that was because we had significant development going on in the Woodlands, as you know, with the Hughes Landing, Town Center, the village of Creekside Park, even the West Sterling Ridge. There was just a lot of growth during that time, and that drove up sales tax, and that in turn allowed the board to be able to lower the property tax in relation to that. In the more recent years, as we've reached build out, and for residential, we're not there yet, but we're closer. And as the construction and the commercial has declined, it's not gone away by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not as robust as it used to be. That is why you see the flattening out of both the property tax rate and the effective rate that goes along with that. But overall, the board has, since the inception, decreased the property tax rate by about 47%. So this is, look, when we apply the rate, right now this preliminary budget, this base budget is based on maintaining the rate at 22.31 cents. And when you apply that rate to the property, the taxable values, that's going to generate for the 2022 budget $48.6 million in property tax revenue. The other piece of information that we were waiting on in order to be able to finish our analysis of the incorporation model and of the base budget was our sales tax report, the most recent one. So this is for the August report, which is a 2-month lag. So this is relating back to June activity. You can see through the 8 months, we have collected $36.6 million in sales tax revenue. That is $4 million or 12.5% greater than the same period for the previous year, and we are almost $2 million or 5.7% above budget. So you can see here, just for the month of July, we were over budget by $914,000. So things are very robust for the township in terms of sales tax, and I talk about it all the time, but this is retail. This is definitely retail, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But we have many different categories of sales tax, many different business sectors, and what we see when we look at the trends for information, for professional services, for manufacturing, for wholesale trade, for all of the different categories, they are all on an upward trend right now, and that is certainly reflected in that number right there. So with those, I'm just going to give you two summary slides on where we are with the consolidated budget. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, we've already gone through many of the details. We will again next week, so I'm not going to spend time at this meeting on that. But right now, our total operating revenue budget is projected at $132.7 million. That's a $5.1 million or a 4% increase over the 2021 forecast. In terms of consolidated expenditures, we are projected at $130.4 million. That is a $3.5 million or 2.6% decrease from the previous year. The reason that that's negative overall is because we have less capital expenditures in the previous year, but even if you just isolate that to operating expenditures, we are going up less than 1%, 0.9% for operating expenses.
So, Monique, I think it's for people who follow budgets for other organizations, we show our capital expenditures, which aren't necessarily driving tax rate in our overall budget. And I think that's critical to point out. We have a 30-year capital plan, which Monique's going to speak to, and those funds don't require a tax issue. So from an operational standpoint, what's the operating increase?
The 0.9%.
So just to be clear, 0.9% is the operating budget increase.
Right.
Everything else is capital oriented.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move into the 5-year plan. And the 5-year plan not only applies with our base budget, because it's built off of our base budget, and then these assumptions we're going to talk about, but this is also what plays into the incorporation model, because what we are doing with the incorporation is we are looking out to year 4 of incorporation. So within this 5-year plan, it would be year 2025 if the board made that decision. So that's what we're going to focus most of our conversation on before we go into the incorporation model. So looking here, first line, the annual growth in taxable property values. As I mentioned earlier, we had a 2.3 revaluation this year and a 1.1% new. The assumption in the 5-year plan is that we would have 2% revaluation and 1% new for 3% growth total. The property tax rate in the 5-year plan is maintained at 22.31. Our sales tax growth we're projecting for 2022 at 3%, and then in the 5-year plan, just a tiny bit more conservative than that at 2.75%. And then for the hotel tax growth, which we're going to talk about it, but not too much because it really doesn't impact our property tax rate. Our hotel tax is used to fund the Visit the Woodlands and to fund debt service, and it's not used for any of our general operating purposes. So it really does not factor into the incorporation analysis. Looking at the assumptions that we just used, I wanted to remind the board and the public on when we started this process a couple of years ago, our consultant also did some analysis on where they thought that our growth assumptions should be. And so this page, it's small, but I wanted to show it. It's taken directly out of the Novak Consulting Group's report, the independent financial analysis that they did. And you can see there under the probable growth projection, which is the last column, for property taxes, they projected 2% annual growth, and for sales and use taxes, they projected 3% annual growth. So I want to point that out as we go forward here. So the property tax revaluation, as I just mentioned, is at 2% in our model, our updated incorporation model, and that matches the consultant's recommendation. In our original incorporation model, we were much more conservative at 1%. So that is something that has changed between the original model and the updated. Here you can see it in terms of our taxable values. So the numbers at the top, the brown columns, that's our original incorporation model, and the taxable values there listed in billions. And then the green columns are in our updated model. So again, the reason that you're seeing the increase there is because, as I just mentioned, the original model, 1% revaluation, and then 2% in the updated. Now we're going to move to sales tax growth. Our original incorporation model, included a annual growth rate of 1% for sales tax. And the reason that that was so conservative at that time is, you'll recall we had a lot of uncertainty regarding the Anadarko acquisition. Anadarko was the third largest payer of sales and use tax in the Woodlands. We received that sales tax because their corporate headquarters were there, and we were aware that they were moving out. So that was one reason we really wanted to be very conservative during that time. Also, we did not have any historical data to project increased sales tax revenue that was resulting from the Supreme Court decision on South Dakota versus Wayfair, and basically that's where we were able to start collecting internet sales tax on an interstate basis. As it turns out, that Supreme Court decision and the revenues that it brought to the Woodlands was very significant.
Yeah, we can. Anybody raise your hand if you've had a Prime box on your doorstep in the last week? Nobody uses Amazon Prime where all your arms are stuck. I mean, we got to have a little fun. This is dry information. But the reality is, prior to this law change, we were not collecting sales tax from all that at-home shopping. And so this is a huge point that kind of changes and shifts things for us, because everybody's buying stuff online en masse, and now we're starting to get those revenues in. So I just
That's right. And
Chairman, I just want to make a little comment here, since I'm not a great shopper, but I'm a regular shopper. So I will say this. Recently, I was looking for a dress, and you ladies who are not here today will understand. Sometimes you can't find the dress you're looking for. So you go store to store. I tried to shop in the Woodlands. All right, but it wasn't available in the Woodlands. So I decided, okay, go online. I'm not that good online, but I found it at a store in Houston. But being the person I am, I really didn't want to, number one, drive there, and I didn't want to give them my sales tax. So I thought, okay, think. So I bought it online, and this way I get the dress, but the township still gets the sales tax. So,
right.
All right, you ladies and gentlemen, think about that. That's
right.
a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. Thank you, Supreme Court, for making that decision.
there you go. Thank you. And I'll have a slide that shows here in just a minute what the impact on that has been. So again, this is looking at our sales and use tax revenue when we compare our original incorporation model, which is the brown columns, versus our updated model, which is the green columns. And again, the big driver here in the change in revenue that's available in sales tax is the very, very conservative, pessimistic, if you will, 1% assumption in the original model, and now we're back up to, based on some of the information you've just seen, and in conjunction with the consultant's recommendation as well, we're back up to 3% for 2022, and then 2.7%, 2.75 thereafter. This is what we were just have been talking about in terms of the growth in our internet sales tax. You can see there we just are growing by leaps and bounds. The other thing that I haven't mentioned yet is there's going to be another rule change that's come out from the state comptroller that goes into effect of October 1st of this year, which will also drive more sales tax revenue to the township. It has more to do, instead of being interstate, between states, it impacts what is right here in Texas. So for instance, I'll use the Dell computer example. If you buy a Dell computer right now, because the company headquarters is in Round Rock gets that sales tax revenue. After October 1st, if you buy a Dell computer, the township will start getting that sales tax. And that's not true of just that. That's just one example. But we know that's going to drive revenue to the Woodlands.
Monique, would you please explain, I've had a couple of constituents ask this, how the new, when you buy online, you may get some sort of record of the different economic development zone taxes. That's showing up with a little more descriptiveness on your bill. Could you explain that for people?
Sure. The Woodlands Township itself, the legal entity, the township, imposes a 1% general sales tax. The Woodlands Economic Development Zone imposes also a 1% sales tax, and the EDZ boundaries directly overlay the township boundaries. So that takes up the 2% maximum that you're allowed in the state of Texas to do for sales tax. So you're right, on some of the bills, you'll see that broken out between the different components. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
The other thing I wanted to mention about sales tax in terms of how one of the reasons that we have revised our sales tax projections in the updated incorporation model is we have some history to look back on. And so we can see that pre-COVID, when that's what's circled there in the 27 through 2019, those are the sales tax growths that we actually experienced. So based on that and the fact that we're growing by 2.75%, that's just sort of in the middle of all of those pre-COVID. And then as we have just seen on some other sales tax reports, we are far exceeding that at this point. Okay, so having looked at our two largest revenue sources, property tax revenue and sales tax, this is where we are looking in the 5-year plan right now. So you can see the total revenues growing from 2022 through 2026 based on the assumptions that we just talked about. And then there are the operating expenses. Those are growing primarily by inflation factors that we have built in, and our major contracts also have CPI factors. And so we include all of that in our expenses, and that's what you see there in the growth. And then that gap that you see between the red line and the blue line is what we use to fund our reserves. So we're going to talk about that next. One of our reserves is our hotel tax reserve. So part of that gap that you just saw, looking out in the 5-year plan, anywhere between $3 million and $3.6 million of hotel tax money goes into a hotel tax reserve that then can be used, which has typically been used by the board for various economic development type projects. So the important thing to remember here is the board of directors has always just assumed that has not used that hotel tax for general ongoing operations. It is only used to fund debt service and on the convention center bonds and to fund the Visit the Woodlands, and then the rest of it goes into this reserve. So that is what you are seeing here. Again, this money could be leveraged for debt service on an economic development project or many other types of projects. Next, we're going to talk about the capital replacement reserve. Chairman Bunch mentioned this a second ago. Our capital replacement reserve is very unique to us right now as a special purpose district and to a city. Most municipalities will go out and will issue debt in order to fund a lot of their assets, even their especially their big assets, but even some of the smaller ones. What the township board did back in 2012 is commission a reserve study, a capital reserve study. And what we did is we looked out 30 years. We had an engineer come in and look at all of our assets and evaluate that, and then develop a plan that goes out 30 years. And we look at our fire department assets, our fire department apparatus, our recreation centers, this facility, our parks and recreation facility, all of our parks and pathways, our IT equipment, all of that is included in this reserve study. It's over $350 million in assets. And we have a funding mechanism where over that 30-year period, we put funds into this reserve, and then we take funds out of that reserve as we need them to replace our assets. And so one of the great benefits of that is that we can maintain our very large asset base, all of the amenities that we all enjoy and rely on. And so again, each year we don't just naturally follow the reserve study, we also do our own analysis to make sure that asset that comes up for renewal actually needs to be replaced, but we have a ready, available funding source in order to be able to replace those assets, repair those assets, and make sure that they are done in a timely manner and don't go into disrepair. So that is a very important component to look at. Here is the township, and if we were to incorporate, that's something that the board has wanted to make sure that we're able to maintain. So at the recent session, the weekend session that we had, the planning session, we did look at having a change in the capital replacement reserve funding methodology. So what we had right now is a variety of reserves that are just sort of like all these different buckets. But one of the things that we have learned, especially in going through credit rating agency calls, is that they only look at certain ones. You can have, out of our 15 that we had out there, they didn't really particularly care about 11 or 12 of them. They just always focused in on the operating reserve and the capital replacement reserve. And so taking that in consideration, the board of directors made the decision to transfer. We had something called a capital contingency reserve. But instead of keeping money in that, the board decided to transfer $5.5 million out of that contingency reserve, which again, not recognized by the credit agencies, and move it into the capital replacement. Additionally, in future years, right now, as we had favorable budget variances at the end of each year, those would be allocated into that contingency reserve. But instead of doing that, we're going to put them into the capital replacement reserve. By consolidating those funds, that is going to allow our annual allocation, which right now is $5.2 million. Instead of allocating $5.2 million to the capital replacement reserve, we can reduce that by $1 million and put $4.2 million, and we're still, as we're going to see, be able to maintain a reserve balance in excess of the amount that was recommended by the reserve study, which is shown here. So under the current funding method, which is shown in the brown column, and then in the green column is the proposed funding mechanism, and then the blue line is what is recommended by the reserve study balance. So again, we are overfunded, or I wouldn't call it overfunded, but we are funded more than we need in there because the board has very diligently, as we had one-time revenue sources, so not adding to the tax rate in terms of funding what we put in there, but as one-time variances, budget variances materialize, the board has diligently put those into this reserve. The other reason it's very high right now in 2022 is because during the pandemic, we deferred capital projects as a fiscal way of making sure that that the funds would still be coming in before we spent money on capital. So that is what is high right now, but over the next several years, we are spending that down in order to get to where we are, but still maintaining a balance well above where the reserve study recommended.
And I think this is an important slide for the audience to digest, because some of the comments that we get is how are we going to maintain the community and the high level quality that we are expecting. We can do that because we pre-funded 30 years of updates, replacements, repairs, and keeping the high quality standards that the community expects and deserves.
Yes, thank you. And then I wanted to show that even post-incorporation, so if we were to incorporate, that doesn't change the funding methodology and it doesn't change our reserve study balance. So we can still see here that the balance in the fund would not change. We're not rating the capital replacement reserve in order to fund any incorporation expenses, and we'll see that in the model as well. We are maintaining those balances and we still have sufficient funding. The other thing the board looked at your strategic planning session is a change in funding methodology for your operating reserve. Again, you had there was some money still in the capital contingency reserve, plus you had a sales tax reserve that was established during the pandemic. It was established back in 2020. There was again some one-time favorable budget variances, and just to be sure that we recovered, we set aside that money. But again, those are not really funds that are recognized by the credit agencies. What they would much rather see is those being combined into an operating reserve. And so that is the decision that the board made. By doing that, you can maintain your balance. Right now, your policy says that you have a floor of 20%. We always maintain a balance equal to 20% of general fund operating expenditures. This consolidation of fund is actually allowing us to get up closer to 25% or at 25%, which represents about 3 months of operations, and that is typical of most local governments with AA and AAA credit ratings. This change in this consolidation provides adequate level of reserves, including those that for 2022 budget initiatives that you might approve and or incorporation initiatives that we're going to look at. And so the bottom line here is that additional funding from annual property tax revenue will not be required during the current 5-year plan. So this is a look at, again, where we are under our current funding method. So that brown, the brown column ends at where the 20% of general fund operating expenses is. Plus, you'll recall the board pre-funded $2 million several years ago into this reserve to prepare for potential incorporation. And now our balance is at $30 million with the changes that I just talked about.
And Monique, this is in line with our attempt to get our bond rating up to AAA, correct?
Yes, thank you. Yes, very
You
good
get
point.
multiple purposes, better bond rating, because we should be AAA now, but we weren't getting credit for our diverse level of reserve funds. But the other thing here is we did, to your point, Monique, we increased the amount to cover anticipated increased operating expenses due to incorporation. What we were trying to do all along is, as we're planning, was saving and preempting and getting into a position to make the cost of incorporation more approachable by knowing, hey, look, if we're going to have an increase in operating expense, we're going to have to increase our operating reserve.
Right.
So we've already done that, and then we've already increased it now. And these are additional cushions against some of the study projections that may not be 100%.
Right.
We're finding ways to make sure we can be highly confident in the output and the delivery of services to the community.
That's right. And the important thing there, I mentioned a while ago, is you did it with one-time types of funding that came through. So it wasn't ongoing revenues like a property tax levy that funded all of these reserves. It was just saving monies that materialized from budget variances. So again, we wanted to look at what the operating reserve would look like post-incorporation. So again, at this same $30 million balance in there, the blue line that is shown there on sort of the yellowish green bars, that shows what 20% of general fund operating expenses would be. So it's higher than the brown, which is sort of our bar for the current pre-incorporation, but it's still definitely, we have sufficient funding to cover that, and even that, if you went all the way up to the 30 million, we'd be right around that 25% mark. One of the questions that has been raised is that this is all fine and good, except what happens at the end of the 5-year plan. You can't just keep $30 million forever, and that's true. At some point in time, that number will have to increase as expenses increase over time. So I wanted to point out that even though we are focused on the 5-year plan and we are focused on year 4 of incorporation, we always the board of directors and the finance team always look out beyond that 5-year plan to make sure that we're able to sustain whatever decisions are being made within that shorter time frame. So what we are saying here is that, yes, in the 5-year plan, we're talking about allocating that $4.2 million all to the capital replacement reserve. But just outside of our 5-year plan, what we're saying is that $4.2 million is going to be adequate to fund both of the reserves. So it may not continue to go $4.2 million all the way to the capital replacement reserve. $1 million of it may start going to the operating reserve instead. But the point here is that the $4.2 million, even when we go 10, 12 years out, is sufficient to keep the operating reserve and the capital replacement reserve within the parameters that we just talked about. And this also goes along with the fact that we look outside of our 5-year plan. So I just wanted to, we don't talk about this a whole bunch, even though it's always on my radar for sure, but these are obligations that the township will pay off just outside of the 5-year plan. So this will be additional revenues coming into the township, just beyond where we are now. So we have some debt service that will be paid off in 2027. One of our EDZ sales zones will be paid off, the obligation there, so that is sales tax revenue, $1.5 million that'll come back to the township. Again, additional debt that will be paid off within the next 5 or 6 years, and then also the final EDZ payment will be paid off. So again, all cash flow, not within this 5-year plan, but within the next 5 years. And these are just our other reserves, which are more either legally mandated or have to be saved for bond covenants. These reserves are not impacted by incorporation, but I did just want to mention these were our additional ones that we have. Okay, so when we take all of that into consideration, all of our revenues, our expenditures, our capital, and our debt service payments, and the annual allocations that we just talked about for reserves, what we are left with is an undesignated fund balance. So these are monies that are still available to be used for other purposes, to be allocated to additional reserves, to be used for budget initiatives. In the past, the board has used them to pay off debt, has used them for economic development projects, but as of right now, with the assumptions that we've talked about, this is where we are. So for
Monique, which brings up a really valid point too. Not only did we drive down the tax rate over the last decade, but how much debt have we paid off?
I know it's been a reduction of 40%. I can't remember the exact
It's around
amount.
$50 million.
$50 million, okay, thank you. So looking specifically for the 2022, and let me go back to this, just so there's a pretty big gap between 22 and 2023, and that is because of some of those funding changes that we just talked about on the reserves. So this year in 2022, we're still making the full $5.25 million. That's what we needed in our analysis, but $1 million, we won't need that additional $1 million next year. So that's part of what you're seeing with that increase. Same for the operating reserve. And then the board also decided to reserve $1.1 million out of 2022 to address the additional West Side company for the fire department. So we're going after a grant to fund the operating cost, but the capital cost would not be covered by that grant, and so we've reserved the funds for fire apparatus and equipment out of the 2022 amount. What we have left over, even after doing all of that, is the $3.3 million. Mentioned that the Budget Task Force met last week and has identified approximately $1.4 million in initiatives that it's going to recommend to the board at next week's budget workshop meetings. I've just listed some examples over there. It doesn't mean that the board has to agree to all of those. Those are just the ones that are going to be covered next week. So we've set aside some money for that. And then the rest of it would go into the capital replacement reserve if the board chose to do that, because we do have projects that happen outside of the normal budget process. And right now, you can see those listed over there: Performing Arts Center, Spring Creek Trails, parking at the Alden Bridge Sports Fields. There's going to most likely do a needs assessment for Parks and Recreation, and there will be projects identified in that. So that would be some money that would be available in order to address those projects if the board chooses. Okay, with that, we are going to move to the incorporation model itself.
I have a quick question about
Sure.
a sales tax. Would you just remind us what percentage and dollar amounts of our sales tax goes to Conroe and Houston?
Yes, so for Houston, it's 1/16 of 1%. So that is about 1.6 million, 1.7 million a year. And then the Conroe, it's also 1/16 of 1% of the ETJ. And that's a small amount, like 55,000. Yes, sir. Okay, one reserve that we didn't just talk about was the incorporation reserve. So this is we did mention that the board has been, with some favorable variances that have occurred over the last several years in preparation for the study and for potential incorporation, have set aside funds. It was at 15 million. That's the number y'all are probably all familiar with. But again, in that consolidation of funds this year, the board had $5 million set aside in a site plan reserve that really is more appropriately located in the incorporation reserve. So that's how we got to the 20 million. According to what the consultant study, and you can see there in year 2, we would need about $10.2 million in order to fund a public works facility and equipment. And so that is what you see reflected there in the dark green, and that would draw down those funds. And then police startup capital over a 3-year period would be about $5.3 million. And so again, those are funds that we are anticipated will be funded from the reserve. That would leave us with about a $17 million balance in the reserve. And so one of the uses, the potential uses, this has not been a decision made by the Board of Directors, but we just wanted to show what a potential use of those reserve funds would be. So within the incorporation model, we have a police municipal court facility that will require financing. In the original model, it was assumed the $30 million cost would be financed over 20 years at a 2% interest rate. And so the annual debt service was $1.8 million on that. In our updated model, we have the same cost at $30 million, but those assets we would typically finance over 30 years. And at the current interest rate provided by our financial advisor, we plug that in. So instead of $1.8 million, it would be a $1.2 million annual debt service. But what the next box shows is that we could utilize those monies in the incorporation reserve, and instead of financing $30 million, we could use $16 million and we could finance $14 million. And then if you have the same term and the same interest rate, that debt service gets down to $562,000, or about a quarter of a penny. If issuing general obligation bonds require voter approval. So this is something that would come back to the residents, to the voters, to vote on outside of our initial incorporation tax rate. We can't load any type of debt service into the initial maximum tax rate because you legally can't until you issue those bonds, and then you can impose that tax rate. So that would be, to be completely transparent, that would be a quarter of a penny if that's the direction the board decided to go. But I want to point out that we have funding within the base budget that would cover that debt service. So we could impose the quarter of a penny, but that increase would be fully offset by favorable variances that we have within the budget. One of those is from a savings from a new streetscape contract, which is something the board is going to consider on Monday. It's actually, and the Budget Task Force has already looked at it, it is enhancing our current levels of service for a cheaper price, for savings at around $462. So any questions on this? Keep going? Okay. So on the police, the municipal court facility, again, that initial maximum tax rate for incorporation cannot legally include a debt service rate because that rate cannot be imposed until the bonds are approved by the voters and issued. And as I just pointed out, there are sufficient operating revenues to fully offset an increase in annual debt service that would arise from the issuance of the bonds to finance a police station. The other thing that incorporation, one of the important things that incorporation would allow the township to do is to offer tax relief for our senior citizens, for persons 65 and older, and disabled citizens. State law right now provides for a property tax ceiling, also commonly referred to as a tax freeze, on homestead property. School districts can do that, cities, counties, and junior college districts can offer a property tax freeze. But special purpose districts, such as the township, are not able to offer that type of tax relief for our seniors and disabled citizens. Just wanted to show everyone this is how a tax freeze would work if the board chooses to offer this as an option under incorporation. So in your first year of qualifying, for us, as I mentioned earlier, average value home is $459,000. If it was at the current tax rate of $2231, your tax ceiling would be $1,024 in annual township taxes. Let's say in year 2, you had a tax rate increase and you had a revaluation increase of 2%. So your value went to $468,000. Your tax rate increased to 23 cents. Well, normally that tax would be $1,077 based on that, but it's going to be capped at $1,024. Say in year 2, you had a tax rate decrease, and so your tax only ended up being $998. Your ceiling would drop to that $998. But the important thing here is unless you improve your home, unless you make major improvements to your home, and that's what's driving up your value, as a senior, anyone that qualifies for the tax freeze, your tax is going to be capped at $1,024.
Let's stay on this slide for a minute so people
Okay.
can absorb it. We've talked a lot about the benefit to our seniors, and right now our senior population is about, what, 10 to 15% of our residents. And
Yeah.
we went through a demographic study with Conroe Independent School District on the growth in the area and the demographics of the Woodlands and how it related to the schools. But it also showed us our aging population. So this tax freeze and for 65 and disabled may only affect about 17% of our residents, but that percentage is going to grow every year as we have more people mature into the 65 age band. And it's projected, I believe, within 10 years to be a third of our population would be in that category. And so I know we hear a lot of the lack of benefits, but I would pretty much like to lock in all my taxes now if I could. I'm not 65, but I think this is one of those incredible benefits to the community and our seniors who are concerned about somebody mentioned the increase in property values. Well, as you see here, the increase in property values and appraisals will have no impact on our seniors under an incorporated model with a tax freeze. And this board in our financial planning, we put in the tax freeze into the financial model. So reducing our own revenues to provide affordability certainty to our senior residents and those that are disabled. I don't want to discount the fact because there are people under 65 that are going to still benefit from this too. So it's not just an age thing.
Correct. And then also, the other benefit of the tax ceiling applies even if the township issues additional debt. So even with the bond and the debt rate, this ceiling is still going to apply. So again, another important benefit.
And there's no CPI inflation index either.
No,
It's dollar certain.
it is, that is the.
And if you think inflation, anybody think inflation's going up in the next year or two or three? I mean, it's going to be higher than a kite.
Right.
Chairman,
I'm sorry, Paul, they can't hear your question. He was asking, could we have had this addressed at legislative level? My last visit to the legislator was in 2017, where I had to get our enabling legislation corrected because we didn't have the perfected right to become a city until we went through that process through the legislators in 2017. Every meeting I went to, they basically said, stop asking for things that you get as a city. We've given you the authority to become a city. If you want the rights of a city, incorporate and stop coming back to the state and asking for special treatment. That was the response I was given.
So then this just shows that over time, obviously, you would have a cumulative effect. So some of the numbers we were looking at just a second ago were fairly small for 1 year, but over time, it certainly is a great benefit, again, for our seniors and disabled citizens. Okay. With that, we're going to actually get into the incorporation model now. So I want to remind everybody in the original model where we started out. The total tax rate that was determined by the consultants was 28.62 cents based on the assumptions and the initiatives that were approved by the board of directors at that time. 22.40 cents was the base budget. That was the tax rate back in 2020 for the base budget. On top of that, there was an additional 6.22 cents in order to have a balanced budget in year 4 of incorporation. Out of that 6.22, there was 4.39 cents that was related directly to the incorporation initiatives. Plus, we had a deficit in the base budget that required 1.83 cents in order, again, to get to that balanced budget. And so now I am going to get out of here, and I'm going to pull up the incorporation model itself. Okay. So what we're going to go through here is how that 6.22 cents was derived in order to balance the budget, the incorporation model during the 2020 budget were with Novak Consulting and based on the assumptions that were decided at that time. So we're going to start off with the revenue sources, and then we're going to look out to fiscal year 25, which again is the fourth year of and I know it's not been determined, but we had to pick a year. So just looking out from where we are right now, fiscal year 25 would be the fourth year of incorporation. So starting with our sources of funds. There's a mixed beverage tax that the township is not eligible to receive at this point in time, but would under incorporation. And that is not money that that money is coming, the state of Texas is getting those funds right now. So under incorporation, part of what the state of Texas would get would then come to the township. So you can see there it was at $960,000 assumed for all years in the incorporation model. Franchise fees, again, this was based on a study of peer cities by the consultants, and all that information is online and the peer cities and what their franchise fees were. And so based on that, they are estimating when we get for a full year that we would have $7,176,000 in franchise fees. The solid waste user fee, most municipalities charge a separate fee. Your trash is not included in your property tax rate. Most municipalities that the consultant looked at had a separate fee for solid waste, so that was an option that was presented to the board of directors if you wanted to move in that direction, and the answer was no. So we are not showing any revenue to the new city related to that. And then there were fines and forfeitures, and those were going to be used as a direct offset to pay for some court and some court cost. So that even though that is a revenue source, it would be fully offset by a related expense. Same thing for permit fees, projecting $150,000, but you can see actually several lines down there, there's a building permit review expense that is fully offsetting that $150,000. In terms of uses of funds, we just talked about this, which was for the property tax ceiling for our senior citizens and disabled citizens. In the original model, we were basing that on a 1% revaluation, and so you can see the expense that would be associated with that. We just talked the next line down about the building permit review. Let me go down a little bit here. Whoops, too far. We had 3 positions that were identified by the consultant that under a city would be absolutely critical that we have. So that would be a city secretary, a risk manager, and paralegal. And you can see the cost associated with that there. The consultant, again, in reviewing our peer cities, looked at the public works, which is the responsibilities of public works would transfer from the county to the new city. Once the incorporation happens. So you can see there that the different operating expenses, bridge maintenance, shoulder maintenance, and pavement improvements that would be associated with a public works department. So I do want to mention that these costs right here that we're looking at for public works are incremental to some of the public work types costs that we already do. So we have streetscape maintenance being one of the largest ones. So we already have $6.8 million in our own budget, in our existing base budget, that we're already spending towards public works types of functions. And then the cost that you're seeing here would be the incremental. Same concept for the law enforcement operating expenses. We currently have about $16.1 million in expenses in our base budget that we are already contributing to law enforcement services because we contract for enhanced law enforcement services.
Monique, can you scroll over to the right of your spreadsheet?
Sure.
I think it's closer to 14 million. Yay.
I'm sorry, did I say 16, 14? You're keeping me honest.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just so, and again, I'm seeing new faces, so I'll just point out, all 92 patrol deputies from Montgomery County are fully funded today by the Woodlands Township. We purchase their vehicles, we pay their retirement plans, we pay their overtime, we basically are funding 92 of the that's all the patrol deputies on Montgomery County. I think we're funding 12 in Harris County. So the dedicated patrol in Harris County Creekside Park is also 100% funded by the Woodlands Township. That's why when you hear taking on law enforcement's this huge, expense, it's an incremental additional cost above the $14 million we currently already spend. That $14 million is already coming out of our current tax rate. So this is why she's showing you the incremental cost. And I just want to be clear because I know I get hit up with that all the time. Starting a law enforcement, is good. You guys are going to bankrupt us. You're going to quadruple my taxes. We're already paying $14 million a year in law enforcement to Montgomery County and to Harris County, including the capital required.
That's correct, yes. Thank you. Next line item down is debt service on the bonds issued for a police court facility, and we just talked about all of that, so I'm not going to go over that again, but you can see in the original model, there's the $1.8 million in debt service that we picked up. So in total, then we had general fund expenses of $18.4 million on those initiatives. In addition to that, as I also mentioned a little bit earlier, we were having to pick up a funding surplus that was in our 5-year plan, and that was the $3.8 million, and I think I mentioned a minute ago that was about 1.8 cents in tax rate.
That was a funding deficit.
Yes.
You said surplus.
Oh.
Just trying to be
No,
clear.
I guess I'm reading there and not paying attention. It was a funding deficit.
It was a funding
monies-
deficit, and at the time, this is where we had Anadarko exiting. This is where we greatly reduced our sales tax projections, and this is where we had no idea how much, if any, we would get in sales tax.
Exactly, thank you.
That was creating the deficits in the out years.
That is correct. So in total, that means we had general fund expenses, including that deficit of about $22.2 million. When you offset that with the revenues that were available, we had net expenses in the original incorporation model of $13 million.
Does it show anywhere the tax rate off of that, or is that what you're trying to get to?
Yes, that's what we're getting to right here. So again, this is the summary. We had it under the original model. We had incorporation revenues of the $9.1 million. We had expenses of the $18.3 million for net cost of $9.2 million, and then we added onto that the funding deficit that we just talked about of $3.8 million, and that's how we got to the $13 million. So again, adding to the 2240 tax rate that was already in the base budget, we needed an additional 6.22 cents in order to completely balance the budget. And that made the initial maximum tax rate under the initial model was going to be 28.62 cents. So just wanted to walk everyone through that first to show that we're tying exactly and we reconciled exactly to the consultant's rate and the consultant's initiatives. So now what I want to do
And
is...
even further, so I know no one's asked the question yet, this also includes the updates to our 5-year base budget that did bring in the increased wage costs from the recent law enforcement payroll increase.
They did the 5% that the county approved.
Right.
Yes, that's included. Okay, so now I want to, as part of this updating of the model, want to walk the board through the initiatives that we just looked at and see if there are any changes that you want to make to that. So these have been presented to the Incorporation Task Force and were recommended. So we're going to go through here and explain each one. And those are the ones that you're going to see highlighted in yellow. So one of the things that I wanted to mention, and actually this is in agreement with what the consultant with Novak originally recommended, is that we would have a growth factor in our revenues just like we did in our expenses. If you look down at the expenses, even just the ones you can see right there on the screen, you can see they're growing every year. There's a 2% growth factor, inflation factor, if you will, and those expenses are growing. But in an ultra-conservative move, there was no growth in the revenues. And obviously, that is not a sustainable plan. Anytime, just like even in your personal life, if you're going to increase your expenses, you're going to have a corresponding increase in revenues in order to stay balanced. So one of the things that we are recommending is that we would go ahead and build that growth factor into the revenues. So in doing that, that's the incremental that would be added if the board is in agreement with doing that. It's the same thing for the franchise fees. So that would be the incremental if we had a similar growth factor in the franchise fees. Same with the fines and forfeitures. And the permit fees we're not going to do because those expenses you can see right here were already at 150. So we're just trying to match revenues and expenditures. So we're not going to turn those on. So those are one of the suggestions that we're making in the revised model. As we talked about earlier, our revaluation is now 2%, not 1%. And so in order to properly account for those costs, we want to turn that on. It's going to make that cost to the township higher. But again, as we talked about, that's something that we want to be able to provide to our residents. And so I'm going to turn this one off so that we only have the 2% on. On these next three for the positions, we are recommending that these be removed from the incorporation model because they are already in the base budget model. These are positions that we have found over the past couple years that we need regardless if we incorporate. The city secretary position was improved in the 2021 budget, so that's already included, and we have the risk manager and the paralegal included in the 2023 budget. If we were to incorporate that, we would move those up to 2022, but those, again, are positions that we need regardless if we incorporate. So in that regard, so we don't want to double count the expenses, going to remove those. Okay.
Monique, if I may,
Sure.
know that you've just stated those three positions are already within our budget, but aren't there others such as city council members? If we do become a city, are they generally not paid? And the same with the mayor?
I think
You don't have to be paid as a city council or a mayor. That's something that the governing body can decide. And then actually, somebody was kind enough to mention it's a two-step process, to go from a general law city to a home rule charter. The home rule charter committee and the residents can actually put in the home rule charter a restriction for city council or the mayor receiving any compensation. None of us get paid, in case you didn't know. If you quadruple my salary, 4 times 0 is still 0. And our model assumes that we're not going to be creating a paid-for elected position, and then our residents, obviously through the home rule charter process, can codify that and ensure that we don't end up creating a political class of paid-for people.
so that Chairman Bunch answered the question, but yes, the direct answer to your question is no, those costs are not in here because that's not something so far the board has discussed doing. The public works expenses and the law enforcement expenses are coming directly from the NOVAC model. Again, these were all based on peer reviews, on reviews of peer city cost, very extensively explained during the consultants' presentations, and will be discussed in more detail. I'm not going to go into all the detail of all the different layers of what makes up these expenses. The point here is that we have not adjusted those costs downwards for purposes of this model. These are exactly what was presented before.
What I want to speak to quickly, the law enforcement operating expense, because that may look odd to people. Why does it go from, a couple $100,000 to, almost 7, 8, 9 million in a quick period of time? We have a 4-year transition agreement with Montgomery County for law enforcement transition services and it's a 4-year deal. And essentially, these financial models mimic the contract that we have with the county for those services. So they'll have some service provided to us for 4 years. We'll incrementally backfill those over time. And at the end of the day, we already are funding the $14 million. We'll continue to be funding that. And then we'll be picking up additional expenses over that 4-year span.
Yes, thank you. And again, we're focusing on that fiscal year 25 column because, again, we wanted to make sure that whatever we did was sustainable out into the 4th year when we're fully loaded on expenses. So the initial maximum tax rate that we're talking about is not focused on the 1st year or 2nd year. It's out there when the maximum, all that transition takes place and we're fully loaded on our expenses. The debt service on the bonds issued for the police station or police/municipal court facility. Again, we talked about that. First of all, it would not be $1.8 million based on current market. And we also talked about how we really already have the funding in order to be able to do that with the Incorporation reserve and using some of those funds and how we have favorable variances in our operating budget to do that. So our recommendation is that we would turn that to no, because we already have funding that would pay for that, and we're trying to be as careful with the funding and not overcharge in the initial tax rate.
Well, we can't legally include a debt service
Well, and that's
anyways.
Yeah, exactly. We talked a little while ago about that $3.8 million that you're seeing right here. That was our funding deficit in our original model based on those very conservative, pessimistic, if you will, assumptions. So what we want to do now is turn that off because those no longer apply, and we want to update it with what is in our current base budget based on the assumptions that we talked about a little while ago. And so if you'll recall that undesignated fund balance graph chart that we looked at out in the year 2025, we had a surplus of $6.7 million. So when we take all that into account, and assuming the board agrees with all of the changes that we just made, we would have net revenues of $109,000. So you'll recall under the original model, that was a negative $13 million. Under our current assumptions, with the changes that we just made to the base model and with our growth, particularly in our sales tax base, we are now basically balanced in the budget. So we're going to go down here. Again, we're going to turn the 13 million off. And we're going to load in our new ones. And then this is just as a reminder, this is where we were with the original model. And now with our updated model, assuming the tax rate, the current tax rate of 22.31 cents, and then what we would need for incorporation based on what we just saw would actually be zero. Actually, this is showing that you could decrease it by a tiny little bit, which is not what we're talking about here, so we would be limited at zero. So the conclusion here is that at the current tax rate of 22.31 cents and based on the assumptions that we looked at in the base model and the incorporation initiatives in the updated model, that the maximum annual tax rate would be the current tax rate of 22.31 cents. Any questions with that?
I'm sure that's going to stir some questions.
Well, just to be clear, does that does include the property tax freeze for seniors over 65 and over and disabled?
Yes,
That
ma'am.
is that's built in.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
That is
That's
turned on in the
wonderful.
model.
That's a tremendous.
Well, go ahead,
Change.
Monique, to show the dynamic nature of this worksheet. Go ahead and go up to the 65 and up, and then turn it off, and then scroll back down, and you'll see that
Okay.
it jostles the output.
Where is it? Right here. Okay. So if we were to turn that to no, meaning we're not going to offer that benefit, and then we were to go back down.
It didn't marginally change it.
It didn't. Where's John? I don't know why that should have updated.
Yeah, it
So,
should.
yeah, I don't know why. It might be because in here, it's not linked directly to our model.
It's not material enough to change it.
Yeah,
No,
and that
it
could
is-
be too, with the 40, because it's only that much.
So I guess go back up and put it back in, because obviously the board wants to have
Yeah.
that
Yes, yes.
provision.
But you did demonstrate it's there.
It is. This is
And
turned
at
on.
and give us the number
Do what?
by fiscal year 2025. How much would seniors and disabled be saving? And then you showed the graph that over 20
Oh,
years,
there
it
it is
goes
right
way up.
I'm sorry, here's where it really shows up. So remember, this used to be $109,000 balance. Now we have $500,000 to the good. So this is showing up. It wasn't calculating in the rate because we were already just limiting it to what we had. So instead of doing it, but this is where it's showing up, is right here. Whoops. So yes, let's go turn it back on.
I think that's very meaningful for seniors to see,
Yes.
and disabled people.
Okay, so if there are no more questions on the model, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint presentation and sort of summarize all of this up. Okay, first thing we want to look at, just like we looked at before, is to make sure that even under incorporation in all of our assumptions, that our revenues are always our operating revenues are outpacing our operating expenditures. We would never want to get sideways on that. So the original model that we looked at, but pre-incorporation were represented by the red and blue lines, if you remember. So that blue line that you see there were revenues pre-incorporation, and the red line is expenses pre-incorporation. So, and that was the gap that we had. Now the green line represents revenues post-incorporation, after we incorporate, and the yellow represents the expenses post-incorporation. So again, you can still see that gap between the green and the yellow that allows us to continue to fund our capital replacement reserve and our hotel tax reserve. This is just a sort of a summary of looking at all the different components. This is what it looked like on the original incorporation model. So you can see there that in order to get the budget to balance, we were required in revenues to have to impose an additional 6.22 cents in tax rate in order to generate the property tax revenue of $13 million in order to balance the budget. And then down under the expenses are the items that we were funding. And then here, under the updated model that we just looked at, we can take advantage of the $6.7 million in the favorable base budget. So at the current tax rate, which allows us not to have to impose an additional tax rate. And then down there at the bottom, you can see the different expenses. And just a reminder there that under law enforcement and public works, those are the incremental expenses that we would need for incorporation. There's already, we talked about in law enforcement, $14.1 million and $6.8 million in public works that are in our base budget. Because there is such a large, a big difference in that 6.22 cents rate to going to not needing an increase in the tax rate now, I wanted to show a lot of numbers on here, so we don't have to go through all of them. But this is the reconciliation between the two models to get to that. And the ones that I highlighted are the biggest differences between the two models. So the debt service on the police facility, again, included in the original model. The market has changed on that, plus we have funds that we can apply to that project, plus the overriding thing is even if we didn't have all that, we cannot include any rate associated with that in the initial maximum tax rate. By law, we can't do that. And then the other big difference is the change in the undesignated fund balance. So I'm going to look at that too. Here are the differences. On the far left-hand column, that is how we got to an undesignated fund balance of $3.8 million. In the third column over, under the updated model, this is how we got to the positive $6.7 million in undesignated fund balance. The items that are circled in blue are the biggest contributors to that big change. In revenues, we've had an $8.7 million change between the two models. Out of that, $6.4 million is related to sales tax revenue. And we saw that on the previous chart, and because of the tremendous growth that we've had in our sales tax base, that's what's contributing mostly to that number right there. And then the other two are the change in funding methodologies that we discussed for the capital reserve and the operating reserve. Since we are no longer having to fund at those levels, we have the savings from that. So again, those, if you want to break it down into its simplest components, those are the three areas that's causing the change between the two models.
Let me also talk to what's not included. We know with certainty that this community is not receiving the federal funds that it would receive as a city. And none of those projected new revenues of municipal funding that we would get from a state or federal government are included in this model. Just with ARPA, which is a current federal funding COVID stimulus, this community should be getting up to $30 million of federal aid. We're currently getting zero. With CARES Act, it was, $6.1 million for Montgomery County, $774,000 for Harris County. We got the $774,000 from Harris County. We got $244,000 from Montgomery County out of $6.1 million. On ARPA, we're at zero. We're currently working with Treasury and the state, but they have told us we don't exist. We like to be called a Woodlands Township, but we are actually a special purpose district that is not a CDBG eligible community, which means we are left out of a lot of funding mechanisms that exist that come out of all these federal programs. We did not include any increased funding that we would achieve from Houston-Galveston Area Council, which is the local cog that redistributes state and federal dollars for numerous projects, roadways, floodways, parks and recreation. As a municipality, we would immediately become a voting member of that board. Today, we are not a voting member. Yes, there's going to be some tax rate certainty for seniors, which we know expressed the largest amount of concern about taxes. But there is other revenue sources that we didn't bake into this that are real and are substantial and can further help mitigate over a longer period of time. And so to the people asking about why are we looking at this in this interim time period, the ARPA Act funds are funded in two tranches. The first funding went out in August. The second funding goes out next year. Their Treasury guidelines only provided the direct funding to incorporated entities, which left us in no man's land. If we are incorporated in this calendar year, we could get the funding in round two, which goes out, I believe, next year. No guarantees, but right now, when we talk to them, we're not a minor civil division of government because Texas doesn't acknowledge those exist in Texas. In other states, townships and towns did get direct funding under ARPA that provide less government services than this community currently provides. Let me just speak to how ridiculous this situation is in the middle of COVID. We fund $14 million of law enforcement. We got $0 back in all that money that went out. Trillions. We have our own fire department, property protection class 1, ISO 1, number 1 in the country. We got nothing. We got some from CARES Act out of Harris County, and we got a couple $100,000 out of Montgomery County. 8 fire stations, paramedics, 4 on the ladder truck, and we're being treated like we don't exist. So we either want to stand up and be counted. There's 120,000 of us worth a collective over $22 billion that are not getting the untold amount of federal taxes that this community pays back to this local community. And we can argue about the timing, and we can argue about the benefits and the pros and the cons, but we have been certainly told, this first pandemic of my lifetime, and probably everybody in this room. Anybody here from 1918? Might be a few. Reality is, they just told us we don't exist. They don't acknowledge the Woodlands as a place. We are on some maps, but I suspect most of you show up as Spring, Conroe, Magnolia, or something else identified by the post office, Conroe. And, you know, when you're looking at federal aid distribution, what's that? Tom Ball?
Tom
Okay.
Ball.
We've been going to the state, we've been going to the county, we've been going to the federal government. We've been doing this for over a year. I know someone said I was talking to the wrong person on why the state wouldn't just, you know, wave their finger and give us more benefits. We've been talking to everybody. And, you know, we have within our own control as a community to make a decision for ourselves. Do we want to be counted? Do we want to be a direct recipient without having to beg for it? Do we want our fire department to be as respected as the fire departments of every other community in our state who are getting direct funded? Think about this. The city of Shenandoah, and we love them, they're getting ARPA funds. They have a population of less than 5,000. We are their fire department. We're under a contract with them. And like I said, we're funding $14 million in law enforcement. So people were talking about what's going to happen to this community and the level of service. All 8 fire stations, currently township employees, currently operated by this group. Parks and Recreation, currently operated by the township. All the 220 miles of parks and pathways. Gold-rated amenities, the niche #1 rated community came from this collective board and previous boards, and mostly our staff. Let's be clear. The people who make this place great and operate the township are the professional executive team that run this community, and the over 400 employees that we have, and they are capable of taking this community forward in a way that's responsible and not overly burdensome to our residents. And everybody can come down on that decision differently. And I've said it numerous times. I think it's in our best interest. I only get one vote. If the rest of the community doesn't think it's in their best interest, so be it. But what this board has been doing for the last 5 years is planning, reserving, working towards a position to give our community an opportunity to transition that not a tremendous burden to their family, and to put us in a position to be counted, respected, and treated the same as everybody who's surrounding us. And today we are not. So other board members want to speak.
Well, just a couple of other points that were brought up today that, you know, just need to be clarified. One about appraisal districts. Becoming a city doesn't change the appraisal process whatsoever. You still have an independent appraisal board. You know, it's done on a countywide level, so that doesn't change. The other question was what type of general law city. Type A is what we're looking at, which is a city manager type, you know, form of government, which lines up with the board's current view that a city council would not need to be compensated in that particular general law model. But obviously, you know, at some point, the advantages of being a home rule city are enormous. So we would obviously be working toward the drafting of a home rule charter where we can codify the, you know, the conservative values that, you know, that have made this township great, which is, you know, no defined benefit compensation pension plans, no compensation for city council members or board members. Perhaps the ability, you know, to have any ordinance that the board or the city council may enact have to be voted on by the residents in order to be codified. I mean, there are, you know, I think we could actually become the model for municipalities in the entire U.S. I think we have that opportunity right now. And I've been on this board for 5 years now, almost be 5 years and 2 months. And when I came on the board 5 years ago, I said that, ultimately this community needs to incorporate because, it's the only way we can protect ourselves and our real estate and our property values going forward. And I still believe that today, and will continue to believe it. But it's not up to me. But at some point, the idea that we just keep delaying this and not allowing the residents the opportunity to make a decision, seems foolish. I really have a lot of faith in the people that live here that, they'll do the due diligence necessary, to make the right decision. And if it's no, and we end up staying in township, it's no. We remain a township. It really is, from a personal standpoint, absolutely immaterial to anybody that sits up here. So the idea that, and frankly, the insulting implication that anybody up here is doing this for the purpose of some sort of fiduciary benefit. I must be the dumbest guy on this board because it costs me money to be on it. So, I mean, if there's a plan to make a bunch of money for township board members on this deal, somebody needs to enlighten me because I don't see it, and it's not going to happen. So, I mean, listen, we have worked so hard at this for 5 years, and and I think really what's important too, Gordy, we were talking about this in the Incorporation Task Force. If you go back and look at the study in 2014, what skewed the study in 2014 was the assumption that we had to take on the MUDs immediately. And that's what really, was playing havoc with the tax rate. This time around, we realized that we can't take over the MUDs immediately because we can't encumber the township, for the debt until after, we've actually been incorporated. So it has to be done in this particular steps. And so, there's a lot more work to do, but I just want to commend Monique. I've been on the Incorporation Task Force now for 3 years, and the Budget Task Force for 2 years, and kudos, great work. I mean, I just I am routinely blown away by what you guys do, but I said a lot of things. We've caught a lot of fair wins at the same time that we've had difficulties as well. The idea that the change in the internet sales tax is huge, and something that we never counted on. The fact that the county actually makes us pay for so much of the services now that incorporating really doesn't have much of an impact, especially on law enforcement, especially on the streetscape maintenance. Essentially, we do all of the streetscape maintenance, which is really a county responsibility as well, already in the base budget. So. I'm pretty proud of the work we've done. I'm pretty proud of this board, and I just want to, thank you, Monique, for everything that you've done, and Jeff and the rest of the staff. I know this has been a huge team effort. Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So the action on this particular agenda item is to approve the update and the proposed initial maximum tax rate. We will, just for a series of letting you all know what we're doing. So we'll work on that motion in a minute. After that, we will have a brief executive session. We will come back and have an agenda item to go over whether or not this will be on the ballot. So you might want to hang around while we break, because that'll be, I'm sure, what most people want to know is, okay, great, these are projections. We did these projections, in 2020. And, if this doesn't go forward, these projections will get recasted in next year. We built this model to be updated every year based on the then current economic conditions and the then current 5-year budget. So I do need a motion in a second to accept the updates and the output of the initial maximum tax rate, I think, which Monique, or do you have more? I'm sorry.
No, I'll just was putting this up there to,
Which is the current tax rate.
right, exactly.
So moved.
Second.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, if it's been moved and seconded, it was my understanding that the 25% hotel growth, there was some concern. I've understood that several large conventions have postponed and canceled. So I have a concern about that. I also have a concern, does it lock in the tax rate as 2231 versus the effective tax rate?
So I'll answer your first question about hotel tax first. You're right about, we've heard about some of the cancellations or at least postponements. As I mentioned earlier, that hotel tax really does not factor into the incorporation tax rate. So what would happen is if we don't meet budget projections this year, instead of $1.8 million going into the hotel tax reserve, it'll be something less. I'm not concerned based on projections at all that we'll be able to make debt service payments or pay the operating expenses of Visit the Woodlands. That's not an issue. It's just what goes into the reserve. And the 25%, we certainly can revisit. We're hoping this is just a blip in terms of, because we're dealing with the surge right now, and that things really will rebound next year. And Chairman Reeser from Visit the Woodlands may want to address something further.
Yeah, Dr. Snyder, just want to remind everybody that last year when we had a disastrous tax rate year, we still covered Visit the Woodlands expenses and debt service.
Correct.
So, and obviously we're generating more revenue this year than we did last year by a substantial margin. So, that number, the total number is, I don't know why this number always escapes me, but the debt service number is,
2.8 million.
and then Visit the Woodlands operating budget for the year is,
2 million this year, 2.5 in the budget next year.
so
Yes,
a
sir.
little over $4 million, and we're approaching 4 as of the next report will be very close to
Right,
4.
right.
So we're good on that too. So
In terms of the tax rate that you asked, so the decision, if the board chooses to make that today, would be the tax rate that is placed on the ballot. If the decision is to move forward at the November ballot, it would be listed at the 22.31 current rate, if that's what the board decides. That is a separate, it's related, but it's separate to whatever vote you would take on the actual property tax rate, which will be, your actually proposed rate will be next week. That will determine if you have a public hearing and you're scheduled to vote on the actual property tax rate for the 22 budget at your August 25th board meeting. So what this is saying is that in order to have the balanced budget for incorporation purposes, the maximum annual tax rate will be 22.31 on the ballot. That's all you're voting on today.
Okay, so, and I shared this with Director Milner just now. I have concerns that we have not seen this. Perhaps other board members have, but this information until right now on Friday at 3:30. I have concerns, grave concerns with that, and have.
But we
some-
did, actually, everything in here has been seen by everybody. The only thing that hasn't been seen was, and this board agreed at our planning session to wait for the additional sales tax report
Correct.
and the property tax to be certified.
Certified.
But all the expenses for incorporation are the same that have been out there and approved by the entire board for over a year and a half. The budget adjustments and the reserves, that was done in a 2-day general session where the operating reserve, the capital reserves, all those things were put in. So the only thing that was new today would have been updating that calculator based on now we got the certified taxes and the another month of hotel and sales tax. That creates the output.
Well-
That's the newest thing. And
Okay, we discussed it, but we didn't vote on it, Chairman, so I respectfully disagree. If this was something that was information that was presented to the Incorporation Task Force, why was it not sent to us within our board packet prior to seeing this right now? It's an honest question, and I think it deserves an honest answer.
okay, the honest answer is we would create a quorum if we did that. So that's the reason why, why we worked on the model, the three of us. But we really haven't changed anything. I mean, all the assumptions that We did in the budget workshop, we're up front.
Strategic planning session, not the budget workshop.
Yep. And so,
I'm looking for
this isn't a case of bait and switch. This is working through the assumptions. We didn't have the tax rolls. We didn't have the sales tax reports. Just to clarification too, if it goes on the ballot, that's the maximum tax rate for next year, not this year.
Thank you. Yes. The tax rate for this year will have to be determined prior to September 30th in order for the tax assessor to
Right.
to do what she needs to do. So and I understand your question. I will, in terms of the not putting something out prior, we got the sales tax report on Wednesday afternoon, and I literally was updating the model for the final adjustments until today. And so it just wasn't, in that regard, that's why it didn't go out early, as we were waiting to the last minute in order to get the numbers.
Thank you.
Okay. So I have a motion and a second to approve the updates to the Incorporation Planning Study and the proposed maximum initial tax rate of 0.2231. Motion and second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Any abstentions? All right, that carries.